The question is the passage of H.R. 6304. The clerk will call the roll on passage.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Allard. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Bai. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Biden. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bond. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brownback. Mr. Bunning. Mr. Burr. Mr. Byrd. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mrs. Clinton. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Coleman. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Craig. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Dodd. Mrs. Dole. Mr. Domenici. Mr. Dorgan. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Ensign. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Feingold. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Gregg. Mr. Hagel. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kerry. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mrs. Lincoln. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Martinez. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Obama, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Salazar, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mr. Shelby, Mr. Smith, Ms. Snow, Mr. Specter, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Stevens, Mr. Sununu, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Vornovich, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden,
The most important lessons learned after 9/11 was that America's intelligence professionals lacked some of the tools they needed to monitor the communications of terrorists abroad. It's essential that our intelligence community know who our enemies are talking to, what they're saying, and what they're planning. Last year, Congress passed temporary legislation that helped our intelligence community monitor these communications. The legislation I'm signing today will ensure that our intelligence community professionals have the tools they need to protect our country in the years to come. The DNI and the Attorney General both report that once enacted, this law will provide vital assistance to our intelligence officials in their work to thwart terrorist plots. This law will ensure that those companies whose assistance is necessary to protect the country will themselves be protected from lawsuits from past or future cooperation with the government. This law will protect the liberties of our citizens while maintaining the vital flow of intelligence. This law will play a critical role in helping to prevent another attack on our soil.
It's you, Lily Marley. It's you, Lily